Welcome to the Data Science Hangout. Hope everybody's having a great week. If we haven't had the chance to meet at a hangout before, I'm Rachel. It's so nice to meet you. Let us know if it's your first time joining, if you want to say hello in the chat so we can all welcome you in as well. This is our open space to chat about data science leadership, questions you're facing, and getting to hear about what's going on in the world of data across different industries. And so if you haven't been here before, every week we feature a different data science leader as my co-host here to help lead our discussion and answer questions from you all. So we are all dedicated to making this a welcoming environment for everybody and love to hear from everyone, no matter your level of experience or background or area of work. It is also absolutely okay to just listen in if you want to. But there's also 3 ways you can ask questions or provide your perspective too. So 1, you can always jump in by raising your hand on Zoom, and I'll be watching out for that. 2, you can put questions into the Zoom chat, and feel free to just put a little star next to it if you want me to read it. And I can call on you to introduce yourself and add some context otherwise. And then 3rd, we have a Slido link where you can ask questions anonymously. And Tyler, already shared that in the chat right now. And so we do share the recordings of each session to the Posit YouTube. So you can always go back and rewatch or share with a friend. But with all of that, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Nick, for joining as the co-host today. Nick Pylypiw is Chief Data Officer at Cape Fear Collective. And Nick, I'd love to have you introduce yourself and maybe start off by sharing a little bit about your role and also something you like to do outside of work.
Sure. So my name's Nick Pylypiw. I'm the Chief Data Officer at Cape Fear Collective. We are at, Cape Fear movie. People are always like, is it Cape Fear like the movie? It is based on, so Cape Fear region's the kind of southeastern North Carolina region, kind of Wilmington, if you're familiar with that area. We are a nonprofit based out of Wilmington that's really focused on the state of North Carolina now. And we're really looking to use data to move the needle on these kind of social impact issues, social determinants of health. My background is more in private sector data science consulting. So I worked for a couple consultants and was doing work with Southwest Airlines and Procter & Gamble and Lowe's and Baltimore Ravens and Cincinnati Reds and a bunch of different organizations, and really looked at this as an opportunity to kind of make an impact in the state that I'm from and that I love. Some things that I do outside data is just kind of building stuff in my yard. I'm building a porch now, a screened-in porch in the back of my house. I'm into music and surfing and just kind of hanging out here in coastal North Carolina.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for joining us. And it's really impressive to hear your journey and all the different types of organizations that you've worked in. I know from your bio, you were once a teacher as well, and I'm curious to kind of hear a little bit about that journey into data science.
Yeah, so I did get my undergraduate. I got an undergraduate in math and math education. It was a dual major, and taught high school math for a couple of years, geometry and AP statistics, and found myself really every day in class with these AP statistics kids, kind of talking to them about, here's why statistics is so cool, and here's all the awesome things you can do with this and the applications, and realized, of course they're like, yeah, all right, whatever, Mr. P. And really realized that I was talking myself into going back to grad school. So came home one day and told my wife, I said, I think I want to go back to school and get my master's in data science. So went back, left the classroom, went back to the NC State Institute for Advanced Analytics and got my master's degree there, and then kind of went into the data science world and haven't really looked back since. I still miss teaching sometimes, but I get to do a lot of teaching in my leadership roles in my organizations as well. So I've got a lot of junior devs I've got 6 data scientists on my team at Cape Fear Collective. I've had a number of interns and volunteers over the years that I still get to kind of scratch that itch for teaching a little bit just in outside the classroom.
I was just going to ask you, what does that like teaching look like now within your organization, like helping new users learn?
Yeah, code review, just kind of scaffolding. A lot of the things I like to say that I can teach anybody to code. What I can't teach people to do is be curious and kind of think about the kinds of things they should be asking on a project. So a lot of times on a project, especially with a junior dev, I'm showing them my thought process. I'm thinking out loud and kind of like, a lot of times, they'll, hey, I've got this error and I can't figure this out. It's like, all right, let's screen share. It's like, all right, first of all, what's the error said? Well, I didn't look at it yet. All right, well, that's the first thing to do is look at the error, right? Like, because these things sometimes tell you exactly what's wrong. Sometimes they're not. Some of the errors are less intuitive, especially depending on programming language. But we are an R shop, so we do a lot of kind of R code review, and a lot of it's just, what are you expecting it to do? Is this what you expected to happen when you wrote this line of code? It's like, well, no. So I think a lot of it is just kind of that modeling my thought process out loud for them to kind of see, here's how someone who's been doing this for a while thinks about these things and approaches these solutions.
I feel like I have a lot of power here when I get to ask these questions in the beginning as we're waiting for them all to come in. But just a reminder to anybody who just joined, you can also use Slido if you want to ask anonymously, or can raise your hand here on Zoom or put it in the Zoom chat. But Nick, something I wanted to ask you is, I know you've worked at a few different Fortune 500 companies, and you said you've helped them transform the way they think about their customer strategy. And I would love to learn a little bit about how you did that. I think a lot of people here in the audience might be in a position where they're trying to like get their company to be more data driven and trying to push new tools forward. So that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. So as I'm sure y'all have had someone else tell you, or maybe you haven't, but a lot of people are fans of analytics and data science if it's confirming what they already believe. And one of the things, working in pricing and marketing analytics at Lowe's, if I went into a room with a bunch of people who are marketing lumber and I said, hey, the promotion that you did last week did really well, they're all like, yeah, all right, we really like this guy, right? And if I was like, hey, but it missed these markets and these markets, then there was a reason why. Like, no, you didn't analyze it right, you didn't do this and you do that. So people like data and analytics if it confirms their preconceived biases and beliefs. But if it counters that, then that's where they start poking holes and wanting to kind of find fault in it. So one thing that I've been very successful in my career is kind of starting to build that trust, find some quick wins. What are some small projects we can work on together that are low stakes projects that kind of gets people to buy into and see like, okay, now I can see why there's value in this way of thinking, so that when that inevitable, yeah, exactly. Don't start with forecasting. That's good advice. When that inevitable cognitive dissonance comes, then you've built up some trust and some capital with that partner.
That's a great point. Patrick, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Rachel. And yeah, good morning, everybody. Happy to chat with you again, Nick. You and I spoke a couple of years ago. You may not remember, but you were helpful on a couple of things for me, and so I appreciate that, and glad to see you again. I'm wondering about the comparison and contrast, similarities as well of working in those big corporate settings versus where you are now in nonprofit and, social services and that kind of thing. Personally, I've been in academic and nonprofit settings my whole career. And so it seems to me, it seems appealing that, people really have their things together in a corporate setting and everything is well-funded and runs smoothly. And I assume you can dispel that myth for me, but I'm just kind of wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you nailed part of it. And Marlene nailed a part of it here too, because there's certainly this. It is a myth that these large companies really have everything all put together. Because the reality is, I saw some things in all these Fortune 500 companies I've worked in. I saw things that would make all of you cringe, and I'm probably not going to say any of those because I don't want to get myself in trouble. But things that it's just like, I can't believe you run your stack that way. That is not the way a $80 billion company should be running that. This file should not reside on one person's laptop, right? That should be in a shared platform, locked down, et cetera. So there's that. One of the biggest differences, though, for me, is in large companies, people can hide. Like there's kind of there's room. Your errors and your kind of weak links on your teams don't kind of expose themselves as readily as on small teams. On some of the small teams I've been on, my previous company was 35 people, and currently at Cape Fear Collective, we're a team of 12. And there's no room for somebody to just kind of not be pulling their weight. So I think that's a big difference. Another big difference is, I think a lot of the Fortune 500 companies, whether or not they're actually implementing it, is another thing, but they at least know that they should be. They've heard enough times through all the articles and through the conferences and through their leadership, like, you need to be doing things, data, KPIs, measurements, dashboards, et cetera. They know they need to be working on it. There's some pressure to kind of do that. Whereas in the social space, a lot of this stuff's very new, and it's a dramatic cultural shift. A lot of the nonprofits that we work with are used to being able to just, and I'm going to kind of say this kind of tough, for a minute, they're used to kind of just patting themselves on the back and saying, like, we did good work and that's good enough. And the thing is, like, for the funders and the philanthropic organizations and grants that are funding them, it's not good enough anymore. You have to be able to show us that you're moving a needle, which means you have to set some KPIs, measure them, collect data, and show that you're making impact against that, or else you're not going to qualify for that next round of funding. We can't just do feel good funding anymore.
That's awesome, Nick. Thank you very much for sharing and offering that perspective.
Sure.
I see a few anonymous questions coming in on Slido, and one was, can you talk a little bit about getting your first role in data science? Any tips for jumping from data analytics to data science?
Sure. And this whole analyst versus data science thing is such a weird, ambiguous thing anyways. If you ask, there's people that I know who call themselves analysts, their title's analyst, and they're programming in Python and R every day. And it's like, that's a data scientist to me. And then there's other people who are like, well, I'm an analyst. And it's like, well, are you a business analyst, or are you so titles kind of all get kind of wonky anyways. But for me, getting my first role, I really wanted to be somewhere where I had other folks who could challenge me that I could learn from. I think a mistake that I see in a lot of young devs and data scientists is they go right to a startup or right to a small company. There's nothing wrong with either of those. I've done both, but you're on an island. You don't have the support that you need, and a lot of these. I just saw the joke in the chat. Yeah, that's pretty accurate right there too. But a lot of these larger companies have support structures in place. There's going to be senior data scientists, senior analysts who can help you and know the data sets and can, so find one of those large companies with a solid structure, latch on to a couple senior devs and be a sponge, right? Just absorb everything that you can. And then the other thing that I can provide that I always tell people who are trying to break into this space is nobody likes somebody who pretends like they know everything, because none of us do, right? Like there's power in saying, I don't know. And if you apply for a job on my team and say that you know how to do natural processing languages and modeling, and I put you on a project that requires that skill set, and it's obvious that you don't, I'll know. Like you're not fooling anybody. You're only fooling somebody until it's time for you to use that skill. So be honest about what you know and how good you are at it. If you say you're a 10 in R, I don't even consider myself a 10 in R. So you better be really good if you say that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Marlene, that point about like every time I think I'm an expert at something, I think there's a graph that shows that kind of like the more you learn about something, and then you hit a point where you're just like there've been times in my career where I'm like, I'm an expert Excel user, and then I'll meet somebody that I work with. I'm like, wow, I'm like a 2, and then I'll be like, okay, I've learned. Now I'm at like a 7 or 8. And I'll meet someone else. I'm like, ooh, I'm a 4. So definitely. There's always someone out there who's better at it than you.
Thank you. Another anonymous question was, any advice for someone working for a large corporation that's very resistant to new tools to progress in the data science world?
Yeah. Brush up your resume. No. I think it's a hard thing moving. Someone else made the point earlier that big ships turn really slowly or something like that. And it's true. And yeah, I think other than just kind of keep beating the drum and keep trying to prove value. Unfortunately, a lot of these companies just sometimes it's going to take way more than you to get it. So what I do, or what I recommend to people, is when you're interviewing for that job, make sure the questions that you ask are kind of hinting at what that data culture is. One of the questions that I think is a really good question to ask is, what is a model or a process that your team has built that is currently being used for the company to make decisions on? And you'll be really surprised to hear the wide variety of answers that question gets, because really obvious to hear someone's kind of like fumbling, like, we built this thing, but it never got implemented because of whatever, or we've been working on this thing and for a couple years and it's never quite gotten the traction that it needs. And there's going to be other teams that are like, oh, we've got this thing that's helping with our search engine optimization, and we got this other model that's out there that helps determine where we build new locations. And what you hear there is, this is an organization that is putting their money where their mouth is. They're not only hiring people to build these models, but they're making business decisions based off that. So I think, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Just to give us a little bit more context too on some of the work that your team does today, I thought it might be helpful to hear a little bit about the community data platform, or maybe like an example of a problem your team is solving.
Sure. So one of the problems that we hear a lot, or one of the kind of issues that we hear a lot, is there's not data for that. So our organization is really working to build data capacity across these nonprofits. There's 1,200 nonprofits in New Hanover County, and there's no shortage of passion. They all think they're doing good work, and they are, but there's no real data capacity to understand, what's the value in generating a hypothesis and measuring data, collecting data. So what we always hear is, let's say, well, hey, you've been doing this thing for 30 years. How's it going? How's it working? And they're like, well, people really like our food boxes or whatever. It's like, okay, that's cool. Is it actually like moving the needle on food insecurity or hunger or health issues in your community? They're like, well, there's not really data for that. I'm like, let's see about that. So one of the first things we did is we pulled in Census Bureau data, Bureau of Labor Statistics, CDC, FHFA, And all these publicly available data sources that for us as data scientists are really easy to grab because we know how to use an API to go do this. We know how to scrape a website. We know how to search, Google specific terms that are going to lead us more successful results. But for the average nonprofit community leader, they don't know how to use an API. They don't use Python. They don't know any of this stuff, right? So for the first time ever in our community, we really have this holistic 360-degree view of what a community looks like. And the way we're using that is to do things like, you've got a nonprofit who wants to do something here. We're going to find a metric that works for you and help you build a mission around that. We are going to decrease children in concentrated poverty in this neighborhood by 5% over the next 10 years. And we need $200,000 to do that or whatever, right? Like, that is a statement that is impossible to make without understanding how many people currently live in that situation, what the current projection is for that neighborhood, and kind of like what a reasonable decrease is for that metric. So a lot of our work is really kind of around that, but there's some other larger projects. One that I'll talk about, I'm actually going to drop this link in here, is this awesome video that we just put out. It kind of walks through this, but the Michael Jordan Foundation just put these 2 clinics in Wilmington. Michael Jordan's from Wilmington, and he wanted to put them in areas where they're going to make the most impact for low-income, marginalized populations. The hospital system said, that's great. We know a lot about chronic disease and we know a lot about health conditions. We know very little about the kind of social determinants of health that you've been studying. So help us figure out from a data perspective, specifically where these clinics are going to make the most impact. So that's kind of our flagship project and one that we're really proud of. This is North Carolina.
Yeah, that's a great video to check out too. Thank you. Morris, I see you had asked a question in the chat a bit earlier. Do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think you just kind of answered it. Partially, at least, yeah. I'm working in a nonprofit, and I'm a social work. Transformation is always really the big question. How do we measure that? That's what we want. We're pretty good at tracking outputs, but the outcomes and it's a little bit more difficult. So yeah, but these are helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's actually a question that we struggle with a lot too. So I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of time it's not fair to say, hey, food bank, it's on you, Food Bank of New Hanover County, to turn this area into a non-food desert by yourself, right? And not only that, but the lag in data is such that the USDA only classifies these food deserts every 5 years. So it might be 5-10 years before we even know if you've moved the needle on this kind of macro metric. So what we try to do is we try to tie these kind of micro data metrics to those leading indicators. So we might not know the Census Bureau data for another 2 years because of the lag, but what we do have is this real-time emergency department data or real-time police data that we have for our region. And if we can find the correlation between those things, then what we can do is we can say, we can see a signal here at a right now level that we know is tied to this kind of macro level, and then we can kind of hypothesize that you're moving the needle at this greater level that you haven't been able to measure before.
Another question that was asked anonymously a bit earlier was, how do nonprofits think about the substantial costs of a data team? Are these getting more common with the trend of needing to prove moving the needle?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it's unattainable for the average nonprofit to have a data scientist on staff, but that's okay, because that's one of the things that we're hoping to do, because, you know, part of our business model is we don't need, you know, Catholic Charity Missions of Wilmington, North Carolina doesn't need a full-time data scientist. All they really need is 40 hours with somebody on my team to kind of help kickstart the way they think about data. So instead of saying, hey, every nonprofit in North Carolina needs to go hire a data scientist, it's how do we kind of become that knowledge hub that kind of through contracts, through pro bono contracts over the last 3 years, we've done $2.8 million in pro bono data science consulting. So what that looks like is somebody on my team sitting right next to a nonprofit, looking at their Salesforce or looking at their Excel or downloading their data and saying, hey, did you know that 15% of your clients are from this neighborhood, but that actually like the majority of the need in our county is over here? And they're like, never really thought about that. It's like, okay, cool. So maybe like put some flyers here and let's try to make sure that like your services are right. Like that's something that they'd never really had the ability to do before, because turning addresses into latitude and longitude coordinates and matching it with Census Bureau data is out of reach for a lot of them, all of them.
How did you start thinking about like the different data sets that you might start using? I'm trying to also imagine, like, for people who are working in a company too, there's probably so much data within their company that they don't know how to use or where to get.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I had a better answer for it, but the reality is I just started grabbing stuff. I like to say I've never met a data set in this space that I didn't like. And that's still true, even though we've met some garbage data sets, we still bring it all in because we think that the triangulation and the whole combination of all these different data sets really adds to the story. And I'll give you a kind of an example of this. We're talking to a hospital in New Hanover County, and I did see a question about, is it just Eastern North Carolina? We're kind of across the state now, but we kind of started there. So majority of the work that we do is still kind of Eastern North Carolina. But we had a hospital who was looking at doing some outreach for COVID testing, and they were looking at kind of where do we need to put the Spanish flyers, right? We've got these English flyers, we've got TV ads, we've got signs. Where do we need to put flyers that are written in Spanish? And we told them, well, you need to put them here. And they're like, well, based on the Census Bureau data, only like, I'm making the numbers up, I can't remember off the top of my head, but only like 5% of the people there are Hispanic or English second language or whatever. And it's like, okay, that might be true, but for reasons that we don't have to discuss in this call, a lot of times non-English speakers are de-incentivized to fill out the Census Bureau, and actually there's a fear factor there and everything else. So the Census Bureau historically undercounts them, number one, and then number two, based on your data, you have a large portion of Spanish-speaking patients who live in this area. So there's a mismatch between the Census Bureau data and the hospital data. Who's right, who's wrong, don't know, but it's like if you only had one of those data sets, you might make a decision that's not actually the right one. So by having them both, you have a more complete version of the story.
Thank you. Elaine, I know Nick just answered the first part of that question, but would love to have you jump in and ask the second part.
Yeah, so I'm curious because it sounds like you're regionally focused with this model of a combination of contract and pro bono central support. How does that work in terms of kind of getting to know people, helping them identify needs and so on in your mind versus maybe focusing on, a particular type of nonprofit and working in a larger national, international scope?
Yeah, it was really natural for us. We had some really early success in the first year where people were in New Hanover County and that Cape Fear region are like, we love this, we love it. We started seeing like, oh, all of a sudden people in Raleigh are asking us and people in Charlotte are asking us, and we're like, are we going to go statewide? Are we going to go regional to the whole Southeast North Carolina? Are we going to be like Eastern Sea? When does this stop? And it kind of auto corrected itself because we kind of got to the mountains of North Carolina and people up there all of a sudden were just like, I don't care where you're from in Eastern North Carolina, you don't know anything about us up here, right? So there still has to be this kind of boots on the ground connection to the region, or else for the same reasons we talked about building trust and capital in a Fortune 500 company. If you think about the state in that same way, if you're from from the beach town and you try to go up into the mountains and tell them, what they don't know about their public health crises, you're going to get run out of there with a stick, right? So, I mean, you still have to build these connections organically. So that's kind of limited our business plan in a way that I think makes sense, not in a bad way, like, oh, we can't do that. Now, the other thing is we've made it very clear that we want to work kind of by, with, and through, and not around. So areas that already have, if there's an area in North Carolina that has an organization that does what we do, we definitely don't want to go in there and say like, we're gonna replace you, right? It's how do we work together? How do we start sharing some tools on some of this work? Because we understand that you're here and we can't, there's plenty of work for all of us anyways. So we don't really have our sights set on any sort of, there's so much work in Eastern North Carolina. Here's a stat for you. If you carved North Carolina in half down Highway 95, I-95, and you just looked at the east part of it and made that a state, it would be the poorest state in the country. So no Raleigh, no Charlotte, no Winston-Salem, no Greensboro. If you just looked at the east part of the state, it would be the poorest state in the country. So, I mean, that's the level of challenge that we're working with. So we have our hands full with just that, but definitely are opening our eyes to kind of the whole state.
Bill,
I went
I
on a
see
tangent there. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry. I think I did.
Yeah, I think that like that aspect of working with people who trust you and trust that you know something about their domain that's a good point. That makes sense. And it makes me laugh because I know North Carolina and also makes sense from that regard.
Bill, I think you asked a question in the chat a bit earlier. Do you want to jump in next? And I can read the question for you. It was, Nick, maybe you stated this earlier, but are you using cloud-based resources or on-prem infrastructure? And then the second part is, have you grown your own, or do you use Posit or some other service provider?
Yeah, so we're using, like I said, we are an R shop, so we're using R Shiny and Shiny Apps. The community data platform that we built is a MySQL based product that is in AWS. So we're using S3. So a lot of the stuff that we're using is cloud based, and we just kind of made that decision early on because it was just so much easier to scale it, and cloud storage is so cheap now that it just doesn't really make any sense. So definitely excited to see about kind of the changes that come with Posit. And I'm not just saying that because this is a Posit call, because I'm an R guy. I love R. I've used Python, I've used SAS. I actually started my career in SAS and quickly switched to something else. But yeah, that's what we're using.
Thank you. Marlene, I see you have a question in the chat too. Do you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. Hi. Hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. Love your talk so far. I don't think there has been a single one I haven't enjoyed though, so I feel repetitive every time I get a chance to say that. I'm always curious. You seem very articulate, and obviously you know your stuff with analytics, but I'm always curious, is there kind of a skill set or talent that you think most people wouldn't associate with analysts, kind of like a preconceived notion about we're just nerds that sit in cubicles and don't know how to interact with people, right? What's a talent or skill set that you think people should probably know, like it's probably handy to have, that maybe it served you well, that we wouldn't think of as analysts and scientists?
Yeah. I think it's going to sound cliche, but just like listening and being able to have a conversation. Like I can't hire robots. There's no position on my team for robots. And these days of kind of like, we keep the nerds over there, we kind of like give them their assignment under the door and don't touch them, leave them alone, let them do their thing. Like those days are over. Like there's no space for somebody who does that in most companies. Maybe some very specific niche tech spaces there are, but in general, like listening and being able to go back and take feedback and not be offended. Because a lot of times, there's this, I was actually just laughing at this this meme I saw on LinkedIn where it was like, how people see a data scientist, and it's a bunch of people kind of like sneering over at this alien who's typing in a foreign language. And it was like how data scientists see everyone else. And it's like they're all like cavemen, like, ugh, and they're all kind of, waving these clubs around. And there's some truth in that, and it's awful, but it's like there's been so many times where I've got out of a meeting and somebody said like, oh, well, they don't really know what they want. I'm going to build them something anyways. It's like, okay, that's a route that you can go. That's a possibility. But like, where does that get you? That gets you, now you've spent a whole sprint making a development that they just said they don't want. And now you're going to be frustrated and, double down and say, now they really don't know what they want, but it's really just because you didn't listen. So taking those extra moments to kind of really listen at what they're saying and there's a difference between like listening to the question they're really asking and like finding the question you want them to be asking and what they're saying, right? And that's a subtle difference that I think needs to be made.
Cool.
Listening.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
That's rad.
Have you had to coach people on that, or any tips for us on that?
Yeah. Definitely had to coach some people on that. I think a lot of times it's just, I definitely have the management style of just kind of modeling and scaffolding that behavior. Like I feel like it's easier for people to learn it if they just kind of see you interacting with clients in a respectful way and kind of listening to them and asking those probing questions. Because you can kind of just say like, hey, make sure you're listening to the client and make sure you're kind of really asking those probing questions. But like, it's kind of like, what does that look like,
Absolutely. Miles, I see you have a question in the chat. You want to jump in?
Sure. Hey, Nick, thanks for doing this. So when you were talking about the difference between like, East Carolina and the coastal Carolinas, and like, how do you organically build those relationships? Because I feel like maybe there would be not resentment, but some sort of like kind of like standoffishness of like, okay, this is a coastal guy. He doesn't get it. He doesn't know what's going on. So how do you build that trust in that relationship?
Yeah, and it's even worse when they find out I live in Raleigh, because I actually grew up in Eastern North Carolina on the coast, but now I'm in Raleigh in the capital. So then I'm talking to some of these small towns, and it's like, oh, just some guy from the capital, from the city, telling us how to do stuff. If we ignore him long enough, he'll go away and start bugging somebody else, right? The same way that we talked about, building capital in a big company, especially with this line of work, you'd be surprised at how much buy-in you can get if you show up and you actually know how to pronounce the town name and the county name correctly. If you go into Beaufort, North Carolina, and you say Beaufort, that's South Carolina, by the way, spelled exactly the same, but it's Beaufort in South Carolina, it's Beaufort in North Carolina. If you go into Beaufort and call it Beaufort, you've lost them before even the first slides hit the screen. Right? Because it's just somebody else, from some outsider coming in here who knows nothing about us. So just being able to go in there and say, and one of the things that our data science team has done is kind of, when you're learning about a new area, one of the first tasks that we started doing is put together a deck of just kind of, I want to know the 5 worst areas of poverty in this area. I want to know the 5 areas where there's employment, great employment parity or great employment rates, all these different things. And through that exploration, you kind of be like, oh, you kind of understand, oh, there's this town here and there's this other town here and this is this county, and you kind of learn about that area. So now when you are in a conversation, you can kind of intelligently talk about that region. It doesn't sound like you're just some person looking at a chart and saying like, you need to do this and this. So that's really helped us to really just learn about the areas that we're working in.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Coulter, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Just a quick background. I actually work on the data science team in my local public health agency, and we quite often help out nonprofits. We get tons of requests. Hey, we need some data, but you know, we legally can't get it. Can you analyze this? We want some spatial analysis. But I was just thinking how cool it would be if we had a local nonprofit with the skill that your organization has. So I was wondering if you've ever had a chance to collab with local public health agencies or academic institutions, and kind of what that relationship was like.
Yeah, and I'm really encouraged to hear that some of the local governments are starting to get that that skill set in house, because I don't think that's very common. So that's awesome to hear that. We work closely with a lot of county governments, city governments, universities, definitely UNCW, NC State, UNC, some folks at Duke and UNC Charlotte and some others. But to be honest, at first, especially the county, the local governments are always all in. They're like, yes, please help us figure this out. There's been some kind of resistance at first from some of the universities of just kind of like, who's this plucky little nonprofit who's coming in here and acting like they can do this data science work. And then when they kind of see like, oh, actually they've got some people on staff who have some credentials and some experience and know what they're doing, then their tune kind of changes a little bit. But you know, a lot of times, you know, one project we worked on was there's a county in North Carolina that should be in the MSA that Wilmington's in, but because there's a river between the two, there's a bridge. It's actually in the Myrtle Beach MSA. So like we did some work with the Brunswick County government, because their thing was, look, 60% of our people work in that county right there, you know, but we're in this other MSA in South Carolina who doesn't care about us. We don't get any support from the funding there. So we're kind of in this weird ambiguous limbo space where like, you know, how can you help us make the case to the Census Bureau that we should be in this MSA? So we compiled all this data and basically found all these commuting patterns and, you know, residency patterns and everything else that basically showed, you know, this belongs in this other county. TBD whether the Census Bureau is actually going to listen to us, because we haven't got that result yet back. But that's kind of an example of one of those projects that we did.
Awesome, thank you. Jamie, I see you had asked a question a bit earlier as well. Do you want to jump in next? And thank you all for all these great questions too.
Thanks for the opportunity. I think I'm getting the sense that I may be in the minority and that data science is not my primary work. And so I am trying to sort of know enough to be dangerous about data science just to interact effectively with you guys. And so I'm curious, when you sit down with a client, like a university, what expectations do you set, or what deliverable do you talk about?
Yeah, a lot of times it's just knowledge sharing and data sharing at first. It's hey, we'd love to work with your organization, because a lot of times universities are the path to opening up greater data access. You know, there's financial institutions, for example, who are way more willing to give you know, UNC Chapel Hill a big pile of people's credit card transactions than they are my team of nonprofit data scientists, six folks sitting on the coast of North Carolina, right? So a lot of times that conversation is, how can we've got a gap to fill projects that are maybe too small for you, because a lot of times these universities don't also want to sit next to, you know, Cause for Paws and Canines for Veterans and help them, not because they don't want to, but because they have bigger projects they're working on, Blue Cross Blue Shield and other large projects. So we're filling a need that you can't fill, but we need resources that you have. So we also have a couple projects where we'll enlist kind of the research arm of these facilities, because love universities, love research, love academia. Things move very slowly in the university world, and too slowly for a lot of the organizations that we're working with. So yeah, that's kind of where we see that lane is. When it comes down to doing a longitudinal study, we'll kick it over to you, UNCW. But right now, we just need to kind of do some basic analysis.
And so you're imagining sort of taking the place of a university statistician, data management sort of person, or you're kind of coming in with your own project and asking the university for data?
It's usually more the second route. Like
Gotcha.
we're not really, yeah, we're kind of filling. So a lot of times, all these counties have to fill out these community health assessments every year, or every 3 years, I believe it is. They're mandated by law to do these community health assessments. The universities are totally capable of doing them, but they kind of bid for them, and what you end up with is like UNC has done these, and NC State's done these, and ECU's done these, and now it's really hard for these counties to compare how they're doing against these other counties, because this other county has a completely different format, completely different metrics they focused on. So like one of the things we've pushed on is how can we help you align on a common set of metrics, so that when you're doing it, or you're doing it, or you're doing it, Duke or whoever, we all are at least looking at, you're still going to have room for your own flavor and your own research and academics, but can we all at least agree that like these 10 metrics will be in every single report, measured the same way, talked about the same way, so that it allows us some level of knowledge sharing and comparison. Like that's something that we can, a recommendation we can make as an outside entity that none of them are going to make to each other.
Interesting.
Boyan, I see you shared a link in the chat, and just wanted to see if you wanted to share a bit about what that is.
Certainly. So the Census Open Innovation Lab, which is kind of a subset of the Census Bureau, has been doing a project called the Opportunity Project, or TOP, for several years, with a partner with organizations in order to solve kind of real world problems with open data. It sounds like Cape Fear is really pushing the boundaries of what can be done with open data, but that would be a way to kind of interface directly with government agencies to use the data to solve problems, and develop data products to kind of help local communities. They did have a summit a couple of weeks ago that was streamed to YouTube, that kind of gives you an idea of what's been done. But the 2023 process is getting ready to kick off in a couple of months, so it might be of interest.
Oh, I hadn't seen that one yet. I'm going to put it on my list here.
Yeah, thank you. Nick, I was remembering that we were first talking on LinkedIn about Tidy Tuesday. And I was curious if that's something that the team is starting to look at now, or if you were maybe sharing data for a Tidy Tuesday project, and maybe other like open source initiatives where people could get involved.
Yeah, so as a user, I've done Tidy Tuesday a couple times. I think I did one on slave migration, one on tennis stars, maybe one on a couple other random things. I think it's just such a cool project to just everyone rally around a data set and kind of code for a couple hours on a Tuesday. I'm trying to think about how to wrangle our data platform into something that would be not too overwhelming for that, because we've got this big SQL database that has, I think it's got 170, 180 tables in it. Obviously, we don't want to just kind of say like, here, play around in this big, because people will just get lost. So can we create like a CSV that we've kind of joined 3 of these tables together and say like, all right, you've got food insecurity, social vulnerability index from the CDC, and poverty at a census tract level. Go. What can you do, right? So yeah, we're definitely going to put a submission in, just kind of how we provide something that's like the right scale for an activity of that size.
Cool. Dan, I see you had a question. Can I have you jump in next?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say, awesome. Kudos for still teaching. I love it when people bring their experiences in the field right to the classroom. I was wondering if you could talk at all about, why you chose to keep doing that and what rewards you see.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, it wasn't really a choice. I think people who kind of go into teaching have a certain personality where It's just I was going to be teaching wherever I was going to be at anyways. And I think I learn that way. Like some people learn best through teaching, and when I have to explain something 3 different ways, it just cements my understanding of it that much better in my head. And so I think that's the thing that I really enjoy about teaching is like, if you know something, you can always tell when somebody really knows something if they can explain it a bunch of different ways. If you like ask somebody to explain something and then they say it and you're like, I'm still not getting it, and they just like say the same thing over again, it's like maybe you don't get it either. Like both of us, I think, don't get it, right? But it's like if they can kind of use different analogies, and it's like, all right, yeah, I got it. So I think that is just part of like how my brain works, and I just enjoy it, and interacting with people that way too.
Niall, I see you have a question as well. Do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks. So we get pushback sometimes for our projects not being data science-y enough. And so I'm curious, some of the stuff you've described obviously is more advanced. Some of it sounds fairly descriptive. I'm curious what those proportions are and how much that influences your decision to take on a project as a team.
Yeah, is that pushback from staff? From like people?
It's both. It's both. If people are like, that's not a predictive model, man. Why are you spending your time on that? I was like, well, it's what was needed, right?
Right. I know. I think those conversations are easier for me when it's somebody pushing back and saying like, this model's not complicated enough. I'm like, well, I can build you a support vector machine to do what this logistic regression does if you want me to, but it's going to cost you another 5 weeks of work, and it's going to the R squared is going to be just the same or whatever. And so I think that conversation is easier. The thing that I think I really struggled with when I was building this team. So I was the first data scientist. They brought me on in April of 2020. And they're basically like, hey, we want to do this cool data thing, this nonprofit data thing. I'm like, cool. What kind of data sets do you have? They're like, we don't have anything. I'm like, I'm in. Let's do it. And they're like, who else is on my team? They're like, it's just you. I'm like, sweet, I got it. So as I started building the team out, I had to be really honest with people I was bringing on board that like, if you're the kind of person who wants to do like NLP, bleeding edge, TensorFlow, this kind of stuff, this is not the role for you. We're going to be doing a lot of logistic regression, K-means, K-modes, summary, mean equals whatever type stuff. And so I just approached it by just being really honest with them up front. I said, but what I can promise you is there's going to be a lot of impact that we're going to make, because it's not a cop-out to me to say there's so much impact that we can make with just descriptive statistics and summary stuff right now in this sector that we're just scratching the surface. Like by the time we get into some of that advanced stuff, and we are doing some of it, we've got some pretty big projects where we've done some forecasting, we've done some more kind of modeling stuff, but I think that's how we've approached it, is just been super honest about like, this isn't that role. It's not going to be a Google engineer role.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I remember us talking about that before in another hangout. I was trying to remember if it was Alan who was talking about it before. I see, Adrian, you had asked a question. Do you want to jump in?
Sorry, yeah, I'll eating my lunch, so I'll jump in.
Oh, no worries. I can read it too. So you can
No,
chew your lunch.
it's fine. I'll just stay off camera, so you guys have to watch me chew. You had mentioned a handful of these projects where you were able to really take advantage of these open data packages that seem to unlock some of the questions that the nonprofits were asking. And I'm just curious how much of those projects are shared, if you and your team maintain a GitHub. If I'd really like to start connecting some of those dots myself, just sort of intellectual curiosity. And I have tried to take advantage of open sources in the past, and I've hit a few walls. So seeing some that actually go off the ground would be really interesting.
Yeah, we do have a GitHub. of course, but it is private to our organization right now. Not because we want to hoard the information, but really just because like we're just not at a state where it's kind of messy in there. Like we got some cleaning up to do. We've been going so fast for a couple of years that a lot of stuff needs to be organized, and we really need to figure out too, like which pieces we're able to kind of elevate to the public. We do have a desire to be. I just put the link to our community data platform. Didn't hyperlink for some reason in the chat, but that's kind of a public interface into our it's into the back end of the SQL database. So go and click around in there. You can see some of the sources of the data that we're working with. But the thing is, there's really a couple partitions that we have in our community data platform. There's what you can see through this link, which is Census Bureau, CDC, all that kind of stuff. But then there's like some private partitions that, for example, Wilmington Police Department arrests. We don't want that on the public GitHub or the public user interface because we have a very specific agreement with them that we're not going to do that. New Hanover County Schools, discipline reports and progress for children in public schools in the county. That's in a separate lockdown partition of the community data platform that we can use for some of the metrics we're creating and some of the analyses we're doing, but that we're not going to expose an endpoint to everyone else. So I think absolutely the end state would love a world in which people are kind of pushing and pulling and from our GitHub and saying like, we want to add this new data set. And we're like, okay, here's the conventions for the data set. If you put it in this format, then we can add it to the community data platform, but we're just not there yet.
Thank you. So one more Slido question, and it was, what advice do you have for someone who's interested in starting their own data science consulting company?
So I've known some people who've gone that route, and it can be very rewarding. I will say, almost all of them will also tell you though that they were able to do it for a couple of years and they got burnt out on it. And the main thing is acquisition or customer acquisition takes a lot of time. So I mean, just kind of pitching projects, and you don't realize when you're working for a consultancy, someone else does all that stuff. Someone else goes and like finds all the contracts and says like, you're only seeing 10% of the contracts that actually got pitched and signed and executed and came to you. Whereas if you're owning your own consultancy, you're the one who's got to market and reach out to all these things and pitch 30 different things, hoping 2 of them bite. So I would just say like, be prepared for that part of the slog. But the advantage is, you have your own company, you get to work for yourself. So
yeah. Okay, maybe on
the kind of projects you want.
Maybe on a related note, one last question for you, because I realize it's already the end of our time here. What is one of your favorite pieces of career advice that you've ever received or have given?
Wow. Just so many, it's hard to kind of narrow it down to one. But if I think the biggest one is remember that the interview isn't just for the employer. The interview is for you too. Ask those questions. Don't be afraid to kind of dig deep. Don't be afraid to kind of ask can I talk to somebody who's on the team I'll be working on? And not just my manager, like somebody who's at my level, like somebody who would be my peer, because I want to hear from them. And just really, make sure that it's somewhere that you want to work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick, for sharing your experience and insights with all of us and taking the time to answer all of our questions. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I'm going to put my, I don't know if there's a follow-up or anything, but I can put my...
Yeah, I was just going to say, is LinkedIn the best place for people to connect with you?
Perfect.
Because if we want to share that in the LinkedIn or his link in just a second. Sorry, I usually have it pulled up but it wasn't quick enough on my multitasking here. But I'll
Awesome.
be sure to put it with the recording too. But thank you all so much for the questions too. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.